For this Lent, we're going to receive a spiritual vaccination, so we will be inoculated against fear, anger, and doubt. Our big goal is happiness in this life and heaven in the next. To achieve this, we need to stay close to God throughout each day. But how do we do that while living in the real world with all of its challenges and distractions? Growing our interior life through Christian mental prayer is the answer. This podcast mines the riches of the greatest spiritual tradition on earth so we can grow in holiness together. I'm Steve Smith. Thank you for joining me for Pearls of the Interior Life. Welcome to this episode of Pearls of the Interior Life. Thank you for making this time for the Lord. I'm grateful to be a part of this time. So here we are in Lent. Yesterday was Ash Wednesday. I hope you had a very blessed Ash Wednesday. And for Lent, we're going to be looking at a spiritual vaccination in the soon-to-be-released Interior Life mobile app. There will be a spiritual vaccination mini retreat, and little mystery, where the origins of that were. And back at the beginning of all the COVID pandemonium, we put out a series of podcasts just looking at a spiritual vaccination. There's little we can do about everything going on in the world, but there's quite a bit we can do about inoculating ourselves against all these ill effects through God, through His peace that surpasses all understanding. So we took that and formalized that because it really applies to all of the challenges and trials and tribulations that we face in life. And we've created, again, this mini retreat of spiritual vaccination. And we're going to go through an abridged version of that over the next 5 weeks. As we move through Lent, we'll be looking at each day of the retreat. Starting today, the theme of today is who's in charge here. We'll talk about that briefly, and we're also going to look a bit at the overall framework of the retreat, which is really a framework of our interior life and our woundedness, because we have to understand ourselves to understand how do we cooperate with God to heal and redeem our interior. So those are the two things we're going to look at today. Starting first, the theme for day one, who's in charge here? It's such a cliche. It's a very familiar line from TV, from movies, from everyday life. Who's in charge here? The thing is, we know the simple answer. The simple answer is God's in charge. But there's more to it, really, than that. Because what happens? Sometimes that rings hollow. It shouldn't. We're told that, here from Scripture, the familiar passage from Jeremiah, "For I know well the plan I have in mind for you, declares the Lord, plans for your welfare and not for woe, so as to give you a future of hope." Beautiful, such a beautiful, encouraging, tender passage. Who says the Old Testament is all fire and brimstone? How much more warmth and love could you ask for than that? God designed that future of hope for us, but it can ring hollow sometimes, just saying, yeah, God's in charge. Sometimes, when you're in the midst of a trial, that can be one of the last things you want to hear from someone. Don't worry, God's got this. Well, no, I have this giant gorilla on my back, pounding on me day in and day out, and for all the world, it can seem that there's nothing on heaven or earth that'll get that gorilla off our back. And so the challenge is for those words to penetrate, for them not just to be at this surface level, that something goes, for me, in one brain cell and out the other, but something that penetrates deep down into our soul. And that is a matter of relationship, because obviously there's nothing, there's no catchphrase, there's no just bland maxim or aphorism that someone can tell us that's going to literally change what's going on in our interior, that's going to get that gorilla off our back. It is a matter of cultivating that deep relationship with God, and that starts with trusting that He really is in charge. So in the follow-ups to today's episode, the emails that we send out, we're going to look at 3 specific ways, very practical, very accessible, very concrete, actionable ways that we can start cultivating, doing our part to take that extra step, to turn ourselves a little bit more to God, to remind ourselves throughout the day that God really is in charge, and He really does have that plan to show us the future of hope that he has for us. For the rest of this episode, we want to look at the framework of this retreat, and it's really the framework of our interior and how we're wounded, how we're disordered. And in the rest of this retreat, we're going to specifically refer to worries, wounds, and trials. Worries, wounds, and trials as three distinct experiences associated with 3 points in time. So, first, worries. These are set in the future and they're fueled by our imagination. So this is anxieties and fears, especially the word fear, of potential or imagined future events. Okay, then we have wounds. These are set in the past. They're fueled by our memories. And these are anger and resentment that we have from both the self-inflicted wounds and those that have been inflicted by others. And finally, we have trials, and these are the actual trials and tribulations that we face in the present. And if we're not careful, these can become a source of doubt of God. Right? So we have worries. Okay, they are set in the future. They're fueled by our imagination, and it stirs up that fear. We have wounds. They're set in the past. They're fueled by our memories, and it can stir up anger and resentment. And then we have the actual trials that are set in the present. And if we're not careful, our disordered interior can take those and use them as a source for us to start to doubt in God and his goodness, his plan for our life. Now, there will certainly be overlap between these. Let's say we're going to be going in for a serious medical procedure, major operation. Well, that's a very real trial. There's no doubt about that. But what happens? Well, first, our imagination gets in there and it stirs up all kinds of worry and anxiety. We dream up all manner of negative scenarios. Maybe there's a tremendous success rate. The operation is 99.9% successful, but we're convinced we'll become that 0.1%. That's not a particularly rational fear. It's okay to be concerned about that and maybe prepare in the event of the worst, but it shouldn't rob our peace from us. Or maybe we've had a very bad experience in the past. Now what happens? We have those memories. Of bad experiences, and maybe we still harbor some anger, some frustration against the doctor or the medical staff. And then our imagination will take those memories and obviously just expand upon them. So there's an interrelation between worries, wounds, and trials. But that being said, they are very distinct experiences, and they operate on our interior life in very distinct ways. That's why we divide up these 3. The last thing we want to look at a little bit more today are the emotions, again, that get stirred up from these different aspects of our interior, and that's going to be the fear and the anger and the doubt. Let's start with fear. Now, all of our emotions are a gift from God. Fear obviously has its productive aspect of it. If we're working in the kitchen around a hot stove, fear of getting burned is what keeps us mindful of that hot surface around us. But fear, when it's disordered, causes us to turn away from God. The archetype for this in Scripture is Peter walking on water. Christ, he says, "You call me to you, and I'll come out of the boat. I'll walk on water." Jesus calls him, and we know how this goes. As long as he's looking at Christ, he's able to walk across the water. He gets distracted by the churning of the waves. Fear sets in, and he starts to sink. That is the effect of fear on our life. Anger. Likewise, there's the productive form of anger, righteous anger that gets us fired up with zeal for God. It's Christ cleansing the temple of the money changers, but much of our anger becomes very disordered. Here's an interesting example from Scripture. The first time that anger shows up is in Genesis. It shows up in the story of Cain and Abel. And when they make their offering, God does not accept Cain's offering. We don't know exactly why. Probably it has quite a bit to do with pride on Cain's part. But when God rejects his sacrifice, we hear this: "So Cain was very angry, and his face fell." Isn't that interesting? Here, anger has the same effect as fear. Just as Peter, his face falls. He stops looking at Christ. Cain, his face falls. He stops looking at God. This is what these do to us. And lastly, there's doubt. Now, there's really no constructive form of this in the spiritual sense. In the worldly sense, yes, be wise as serpents. We should be very, very discerning in what's going on in the world around us. But there should never be despair of God or doubt in God. An archetype of this in Scripture is Christ returning home to Nazareth. Everywhere else he can do tremendous miracles. There was no less need of miracles in Nazareth. But what stopped the flow of grace there was the doubt of the people of Nazareth, who couldn't see past Jesus as someone who had just been one of their neighbors and kinsmen to seeing he is the Messiah. Okay, so fear, anger, doubt, they all have this same ultimate effect of separating us from God, separating us from his grace. So that's why this is the framework for this retreat, of looking at worries and wounds and trials and the fear and the anger and the doubt that is caused by them. Because again, that's what separates us from God, and that's why we need to be vaccinated against, and we need to be inoculated against that. And it all starts by trusting in God, which is why, again, our first day's theme is who's in charge? God is. In our follow-up emails, we're going to look at 3 specific ways that we can begin to grow deeper in that trust that God is always with us and working everything for our good. So, thank you. May God richly bless you as we start out this Lenten journey, and I look forward to being with you again.